All right, hey guys, I wanted to talk to you today about coaching styles, and I guess it's not specifically coaching styles, just I was trying to find a word for it because it's a bunch of different topics. So, and also like talking about head coach and strategic coach, it's so hard to break it down into like these very consistent roles because I think if you look at any Overwatch League team, there's no team that has the same composition of coaches where they have a head coach, a strategic coach, an analyst. Like there's no team that has that. I think like what is it? Fuel has one head coach and then four assistant coaches, but I'm sure a lot of them probably do an analyst role. One does maybe more of a one-on-one with the player role. You look at another team, they might have one head coach, one assistant coach, one analyst, one manager. So it's just like different things that you can like switch around, but let's just talk about like what a head coach can be and then some misconceptions that I've seen. So, head coach, they don't necessarily need to have like the highest game knowledge. So, there's two examples that I'm thinking of most recently, maybe like a couple more, but the big specific ones are the Gladiators head coach. It's DPI. I don't know how he pronounces it. The DPEI. There was something where he was saying that he hadn't played Overwatch in a year, and basically he came back to playing, wasn't feeling like it was actually like that good. NA players are probably going to complain about it because it's so garbage. So forget the whole solo queue thing. Him not playing Overwatch for a year. Do you need to be strategically sound? Do you need to be a strong player to be a head coach? I would say no, not at all. I would say take any sports example, take old Korean esports examples. You don't see football coaches practicing their passing game, playing pickup games with their players. Some of them are a lot older, like in their 50s and their 60s, and they don't necessarily need to be able to play the game at that same level to understand at the highest level of what needs to happen. It's also different roles of like head coach doesn't necessarily need to have that in-game knowledge. Sometimes they just need to be a motivator, understand what the players need to do, be able to convey information from the strategic coach or an analyst or a coordinator, and then convey that information to someone else so they can be like the person who's like spearheads all the conversations, so you can be the one who talks to all them. So they don't even necessarily need to have that like game knowledge. Like head coach doesn't need to be like 4.5k player can out tracer duel. He can sit in the server and then just duel his tracer player all the time, and then he can also be like, oh yeah, by the way, our main tank needs to do this better pathing. Maybe for a team, what they need is if they have two or three analysts and assistant coaches and a strategic coach, he just needs to be the voice of reason. He needs to be the guy who's, I'm older. I'm going to tell you guys what to do. The strategic coach and me are going to work together. We're going to lay things out. You're going to listen to me. That's how this team's going to run. And that's a perfectly legitimate strategy to have for a team. Like the head coach doesn't necessarily need to have that much in game knowledge. So, and equating in-game knowledge to skill, I think, is like an extremely big fallacy. I've seen this in Overwatch and in League because I've been involved with both, more so in Overwatch, but they were hiring League coaches before, and I would see that before, and I'd be like, okay, can I try out for it? Must be Diamond 5 or above to qualify. And I'm like, uh, whenever I was, like, actually, like, I hit Diamond 4 at one point, I was like, I didn't feel any, like, better about the meta. I actually like degraded in skill and wasn't able to play as much whenever my knowledge of the meta game became stronger because I spent less time playing and working on my mechanics and more time focusing on watching VODs, understanding what people are doing. And that equation didn't work out where if I was a jungler like I was for like two or three seasons, my understanding of like the pro meta game and pathing didn't improve because I had a higher rank. Like if I was challenger or if I was platinum 5, it wasn't a difference to how skilled I was because I'm not clicking on the map. I'm telling my player, "Hey, this is the pathing decision we should be making. Why is this timing off?" I don't need to mechanically be able to outplay him in that situation to understand that that play that he's making isn't the most optimal one. So, it's a bit weird. I think with Overwatch, it's maybe a bit more lenient because you don't have to be as skilled in quotation marks. Where I'd say I can like casually play now and like maintain GM, and I don't have to really try that hard to like maintain that skill. But at the same time, is that keeping my knowledge of the game up? I would say not at all. The latter games aren't even close to what pro games are, and even scrims are. So equating like Owl head coach has to play Overwatch, has to play at a good level is pretty trash to me. Yes, I'd say as a coach, you probably have to be in like custom games and you have to like understand what's happening in the game at that moment. But outside of that, maybe you go into like drills and like you'll tell people what to do or you'll stand on the map, but you don't really need to be able to outplay people like on ladder games where you do need to focus on your aim, which is much more important. Where in scrims, you focus more so on communication, planning, working on drills, getting the most out of your heroes, which doesn't necessarily equal that skill that you would need to climb on ladder. This more so falls into a strategic coach, an analyst, assistant coach, whatever you want to call them. They will be the brains and they will potentially work with the head coach. So there's a whole different work of systems. You could just have one head coach that decides everything. So I've done this before whenever I'm like the only staff. Maybe I work with a player. Maybe it's just me, but I will decide what we play, the direction that the team goes in. So I'll basically fill all the roles up into one, but I'll basically be doing that. But what a lot of teams has is you have a head coach who has pretty good understanding of the game, but then you maybe have a strategic coach that's more in minutia. He will focus more so on team comps, getting the most of them. Which players play the best heroes in this given situation? Should we be making swaps here? Where the head coach will be like, okay, we got the general vibe, we know what we're doing, so what more changes would we need? And then he would be asking with the strategic coach, okay, this is what we need. Then they might look to like add that into a plan long term and implement that longer term. So it would be people working with each other, and it's not necessarily just one person decides everything. It's probably a lot of people talking to each other, deciding things. Also, you can have a head coach not be as informed, but he can be asking questions to the players. So in League, we saw this a lot. It's like, how is a head coach expected to like be an expert on every single role? There's no time in the day to be able to expertly know each individual role. So you can watch your player for an hour each day. You can watch each one of your players for an hour each day and then watch their scrims and watch games and stuff like that, but that's going to fill up your day real quick. So while your player is playing for that 8 hours, maybe you peek over their shoulder, you ask them questions, you make sure that they understand what's happening in their role, then you keep up to date with them. Basically, if they feel like something's working for them, you can say, okay, this is good. How do you feel like this can be countered? They can talk about it more with you. You can potentially get an analyst that focuses directly on that and will work with them, and then you can gather that information, work with the head coach, and then build something out of that. It doesn't necessarily need to just be one person calling the shots for everything always. It can be a group effort. It can be between that player, an analyst, and the coach all working together. And I think that's how it works best, is because you get multiple different perspectives. You get a head coach who potentially has the more broad view. You have the player who's focusing somewhat on team-wise help, but he's also focusing mainly on his own role and like how he can improve on that, how he can counter other players. You have an analyst who's focusing potentially on that one role or whatever he's focused on, maybe scouting the other team, and then you can start to plan that. So you can be like, okay, we'll grab the analyst the knowledge of this is what we need to do versus a certain team. This player will tell him what to do, and then we'll add it into the big picture. Like, here's our plan. Here's what I want you to do, player. Use this knowledge that the analyst got you. We can build a plan together. That's what you got to do. Making hard decisions. So I'd say this most of the time falls into managerial, head coach role, sometimes strategic, but it's a lot of times it's just what's the hard decision. So there's a lot of different ones. The biggest ones especially are roster cuts, who's going to be playing. But then there's smaller ones that sometimes are harder, which are, is a player going to be playing a certain hero in this comp that they potentially aren't as comfortable on? Will you force them to then learn that? You potentially have to use resources to get that person to learn more. So the biggest, easiest one is taking all the Lucio players and getting them to learn Mercy. And if they aren't able to, maybe you bring in a sub, and then that sub is then going to start getting the main role where he's going to start playing with the main team. The guy who wasn't playing the Mercy as much is going to start to phase out. So there's different things like that where you sometimes have to make hard decisions as coaches, and there's not really like a good answer to like solve some things. So it's like you're kind of just put in a really bad situation where you might get disliked by players because you have to make the decision that will ultimately affect them positively. But to get to that good solution in the end, you might have to make like a really tough decision where you might get a player playing something he doesn't want to play. You might have to kick a player off. You might have to discipline a player for acting inappropriately or doing something that he didn't feel like maybe he did wrong, but he like lashed out at someone. You have to punish them. you have to make these hard decisions sometimes, and it sucks, but if there isn't that structure, sometimes these teams can really struggle to like have like a working system. So if something does come out of line, then you have to have someone fix it. If someone doesn't fix it, then it can potentially just add on itself, and then it becomes like a really big problem where maybe a bunch of like little tiny comments between players can add up to one lashing out really hard on the other one, and then basically they're going to force to not play with each other ever again because of what's said. So being respected is the last one. This has a lot of points to it. It's basically the first one is having respect from the players. So being able to have a decision and like have it be followed through. For teams that have the boss who hired the coach and hired the team and has everyone's salaries, it's really easy for them to say, if you aren't listening to the coach, I will dock your pay, I will cut you, like things like that. It's very simple to have that be the driving motivation. But for other teams that don't necessarily have that, or are more amateur teams, then a lot of it is the players have to respect the coach. And there's this split, I'd say, in tier 2 and like tier 3 where there's potentially like less orgs involved, and like you do have to make hard decisions as coaches, and that can lead to the players actually losing respect for you. So you have this middle ground of like, you're trying to be nice, you're trying to be supportive of them, but sometimes you want them to be doing things that they don't want to be doing, and if they're not doing it, sometimes it's really hard for you to like say, hey, can you do this, with them respecting your opinion and actually following through with it, or them just ignoring you and saying, I don't really want to do that. So it's hard to have that sometimes be followed through. It sometimes come with tenure, but as people get tenure, then a lot of time they'll move up in the scene, and then it'll be very hard for them to like get knocked down because they'll always be on the side of the boss, be like, boss man, this needs to happen, the player needs to do this, then the boss might agree. A lot of times they will, because it'll be another adult working with them rather than a bunch of potentially younger players. So just some of my thoughts on this thing. I wanted to keep it not super long because I can go over some things like a lot longer, and I think I will. I think the strategic head coach thing, as there's more of these things that pop out, especially like newer coaches and stuff that are going to be shown in the new expansion teams, it'll be really easy to talk about all these examples